Hello friends, welcome. Here we are discussing real stories told by real people. Today we have a story about a man who served in the army and loved his wife and son very much. But when he was on business trips, his wife went about her business forgetting about their son. Let's see what happens. Clayton Hartfield, a tall and sturdy man with close-cropped blonde hair and clear blue eyes, had always been proud of his military career. He is 35 years old, and his life seemed stable and predictable. After losing his mother, who abandoned him, and his father in early childhood, he grew up under the care of his father Morgan and Aunt Olivia. Morgan was a strict but fair man, always supportive of his son. Clayton found solace in discipline and service by enrolling at West Point Military Academy. Faithlyn Kramer, a 30-year-old nurse with long brown hair and green eyes, had a soft smile that could melt any heart. She met Clayton at the hospital where he was being treated for hepatitis. Their meeting was unexpected, but immediately left a deep mark on the hearts of both. "Clayton, how are you feeling today?" Faithlyn asked, entering his room with a friendly smile. "Much better, thank you," he replied, noticing her soft gaze. "Your worries help you recover faster." A friendship quickly developed between them, which soon grew into something more. After Clayton's recovery, they got married and moved to the Baltic region, where Clayton was offered a new job. Soon they had a son, whom they named Evan. Evan inherited the best features of his parents, his father's blonde hair and his mother's green eyes. He was a joyful and energetic child who filled their house with laughter and fun. However, Clayton's service required constant business trips, which increasingly left Faithlyn and Evan alone. Despite this, Clayton tried to spend as much time with his family as possible when he was at home. "I miss you so much when you leave," Faithlyn said one evening as they sat on the porch of their house. "I miss you both too," Clayton replied, hugging her. "But you know that service requires a lot." Faithlyn nodded, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. She loved Clayton, but increasingly she felt lonely. Clayton, immersed in his military duties, did not always notice these signs. Despite their love, the tension between them began to grow. Clayton continued to go on business trips, and Faithlyn became more and more immersed in her thoughts and worries about her son. One day, Clayton returned home after a long business trip and noticed that Faithlyn looked tired and distant. "How are you, my love?" "What is it?" he asked, hugging her. "It's okay, I'm just tired," she replied, trying to smile. Clayton felt that something had changed but did not attach much importance to it. He continued to serve, not realizing that their family fortress was beginning to crack at the seams. With each passing month, Clayton Hartfield noticed more and more often that Faithlyn was becoming more distant. She was a beautiful woman, but now he increasingly saw worry and hidden sadness in her gaze. One evening, when Clayton returned from another business trip, he found Faithlyn in the kitchen. She looked tired with dark circles under her eyes and a tense face. "Faith, how are you?" "What is it?" he asked, entering the kitchen. "It's okay, Clay," she replied without looking up from the sink. "I'm just a little tired again." Clayton came closer and gently put his arm around her shoulders. "You look exhausted. Maybe you should rest," he offered, trying to be caring. Faithlyn nodded, but her answer sounded uncertain. "Yes, maybe." Clayton felt a chill of alarm. In recent months, Faithlyn has been withdrawing into herself more and more often. She no longer shared her thoughts and experiences with him. Every time he tried to talk to her, she would shy away from the conversation or change the subject. One evening, when Clayton returned home, he noticed that Faithlyn was talking on the phone. When she heard his footsteps, she quickly ended the conversation and hurried to put down the phone. "Who was that?" Clayton asked, trying to sound casual. "Just a friend," Faithlyn replied, avoiding his gaze. Clayton frowned. His anxiety grew. He began to notice little things. Unfamiliar scents of perfume on her clothes, late returns home, cold stares. One morning, when Clayton was going to work, he found a strange man's handkerchief on the kitchen table. His heart sank. "Faith, whose handkerchief is this?" "What is it?" he asked, trying to remain calm. Faithlyn looked at the handkerchief and froze for a moment. "Probably a neighbor. He came by yesterday to help with the repairs," she replied, quickly turning away. Clayton nodded, but doubts continued to gnaw at him from the inside. He began to pay more attention to her behavior, her words and actions. A few weeks later, when Clayton returned home after a long day at work, he found Evan, their 4-year-old son, playing in the yard. The boy, blond and energetic, joyfully ran to his father. Dad, Uncle Connor picked me up from kindergarten today," Evan exclaimed, hugging his father. Clayton froze. The name Connor sounded like a bolt from the blue. "Uncle Connor, what is it?" he asked, trying not to show his surprise. "Yes, he's good. We were playing with cars," Evan replied cheerfully, not noticing the tension in his father's voice. Clayton realized that something serious was going on. He decided that it was necessary to figure out everything in order to protect his family. But the Army service made its own adjustments, and Clayton was unexpectedly sent on a business trip. One day, returning home after a 6-month business trip, Clayton Hartfield noticed that something had changed. The house that had always been his refuge seemed alien to him. He had a difficult conversation ahead of him. When Clayton entered the house, he saw Evan, their 4-year-old son, playing in the living room. Next to him sat a neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, an elderly woman with kind eyes and gray hair that was always neatly tied up in a bun. "Good evening, Mr. Hartfield," she said, getting up. "Faithlyn asked me to look after Evan. She said she'd be back soon." Clayton nodded, thanking her. He sat down next to his son and felt his heart constrict with anxiety. "Evan, how are you doing?" "What is it?" he asked, trying to sound cheerful. "Okay, Dad," the boy replied, smiling. "Uncle Connor and I were playing in the park today." That name sounded like a hammer blow again. "Uncle Connor, what is it?" he asked, trying to hide his concern. "Yes, he said that soon my mother and I will go far, far away," Evan said cheerfully. Clayton decided to wait until Faithlyn returned to talk to her. He sat in silence, listening to the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, the door opened and Faithlyn entered the house. Her face was tense, but she tried to smile. "Clay, you're already back," she said, taking off her coat. "Yes, I'm home," he replied, getting up. They sat down at the kitchen table, and Clayton felt his heart beating faster. He didn't know how to start this conversation. "Faith, who is Connor?" he asked bluntly. Faithlyn lowered her eyes. She was silent for a few seconds, then answered quietly, "Connor is my friend." Clayton felt anger rising in him. He tried to keep calm, but his voice sounded strained. "A friend? Even says he's picking him up from kindergarten and that you're going to leave with him. What's going on, Faith?" Faithlyn looked up and looked at him. Her face was pale. "I do not know how it happened," she began, her voice trembling. "It just happened. We started dating about a year ago. I didn't want it to happen like this, but—" Clayton felt his world crumbling. He could hardly speak, his voice was hoarse. "You betrayed me," he said, barely holding back tears. "You betrayed our family." Faithlyn tilted her head, her eyes full of tears. "I know, Clay. I can't fix it. I felt lonely, and so did Connor. He was there when you weren't there." Clayton stood up. He couldn't listen to it anymore. "I'll file for divorce," he said, heading for the door. "I'll take care of Evan." He left the house, leaving Faithlyn in silence. There were difficult times ahead of him, but he knew that he had to fight for his son and for his life. Divorce was inevitable. Clayton Hartfield began to prepare for the trial. He couldn't accept the thought of losing his son even. Clayton hired an experienced lawyer and collected all the necessary documents. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to fight. At the first court session, the atmosphere was tense. Faithlyn looked tired but determined. Sitting next to her was her lawyer, a stern, middle-aged man with cold eyes. Clayton was standing across from him, his lawyer, James McAllister, preparing for the case. James was a tall and thin man with gray hair and sharp features. He was known for his insight and ability to find weak points in the arguments of opponents. The judge, an elderly woman with kind eyes, began the meeting. "Mr. Hartfield, Mrs. Hartfield, we are here to resolve the custody issue of your son," she began, looking at both of them carefully. Clayton clenched his fists nervously. He knew that Faithlyn would try to smear him. And her lawyer, Mr. Harper, launched the attack. "Your Honor, my client claims that Mr. Hartfield was an absent father," Harper said. "His frequent business trips left his wife and son unsupported." James McAllister immediately objected. "Mr. Hartfield served his country, Your Honor," he said firmly. "And despite his responsibilities, he always tried to be close to his family. My client, Miss Hartfield, was busy with her personal affairs, which led to her infidelity." Faithlyn blushed, but did not back down. "It's not like that," she said softly but confidently. "I was alone. Clayton was never around when I needed him to be." Clayton felt his anger rise, but he kept himself in check. He knew that the truth was on his side. "Faithlyn, that's not true," he said, looking her straight in the eye. "I've always done my best for our family. I loved you and even more than anything in the world." The judge raised her hand for silence. "That's enough," she said. "We're here to decide what's best for Even." Over the next few weeks, court hearings were held. Each of them was filled with tension and emotions. Faithlyn tried to prove that Clayton was incapable of taking care of her son, but all her accusations were shattered by the iron logic of James McAllister and Clayton's firm determination. Finally, the day of the decision came. The judge looked at both of them for a long time before pronouncing her conclusion. "After reviewing all the evidence presented, I have come to the conclusion that it is in the best interests of Even Hartfield to live with his father, Mr. Clayton Hartfield," she said, tapping the table. "Mrs. Hartfield will have the right to visit according to the agreed schedule." Clayton felt tears of joy welling up in his eyes. He turned to Faithlyn, who was sitting with her head bowed. "Thank you," he whispered, hardly believing in his happiness. Faithlyn looked at him, her eyes full of tears. "Take care of him, Clayton," she said softly. "He's all we have." Clayton nodded. He knew that there were still many difficulties ahead, but he was ready to face them for the sake of his son. Several years have passed. Clayton Hartfield reached high positions in the army. His life seemed to be in order. Even grew up a strong and intelligent boy, the pride of his father. But fate decided to bring Clayton back to the past. One spring evening, Clayton walked into a supermarket. He wanted to buy groceries for dinner. As he passed the bread shelves, he suddenly saw a familiar figure. It was Faithlyn. She was standing with a young girl, her daughter from a new marriage. Clayton froze in place. Faithlyn noticed him too. Her eyes widened in surprise. Her face changed instantly, but she pulled herself together. "Blue," she said softly. Clayton nodded. His heart began to beat faster. "Faith," he replied, coming closer. "I didn't expect to see you here." The girl standing next to Faithlyn looked at Clayton curiously. "Mom, who is this? What is it?" she asked. Faithlyn turned to her daughter and answered quietly. "This is Clayton. We used to know each other." Clayton looked at the girl carefully. Her eyes reminded him of the past. He sighed. "How are you, Faith?" he asked, trying not to show his emotions. She shrugged her shoulders. Her face remained calm. "I live," she replied shortly. And you? Clayton smiled. It's okay, he said. Even is graduating from school soon. We are planning his admission to the university. Faithlyn nodded. Her eyes filled with tears. I'm glad for you, she said, turning away. Clayton felt that the conversation was getting too heavy. He wanted to leave, but decided to ask. How are you, Faithlyn? How is your life? She looked at him, then at her daughter. We're doing fine, she replied softly. I got married. Everything is fine with us. This is my daughter, Lily. Clayton nodded and smiled at Lily. Nice to meet you, Lily, he said. The girl nodded back, not taking her eyes off Clayton. Faithlyn took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. Clay, I want to see Even, she said suddenly. Clayton froze for a moment. Then he nodded. Of course, he replied. I think he'll be glad to see you. Faithlyn looked surprised but grateful. Thank you, she said softly. Clayton looked at her one last time and nodded. He picked up his purchases and headed for the exit. So we have come to the end of this story. Please write your opinion in the comments. We will be interested to know it. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss new, even more exciting stories. We wish you good luck.